A deadline is approaching in Washington, and this time the stakes aren't just political, they're operational. The Department of Homeland Security, the agency responsible for immigration enforcement, border security, airport screening, cyber defense, the Secret Service, the Coast Guard, and federal disaster response, is now at the center of a funding deadlock that could trigger a partial shutdown. Current stopgap funding for DHS is set to expire Friday, February 13th, even after Congress moved to fund most other federal agencies through September. At its core, this isn't only a budget fight. It's a policy clash over how immigration enforcement should be carried out, and whether Congress should attach binding rules to the money that keeps DHS running. Roll call reports Senate leaders have been weighing whether to pass a short-term extension just to buy time, because negotiations on a full-year DHS plan have stalled, and the deadline is now colliding with an upcoming congressional recess. The result? DHS funding has become the last major unresolved piece of the fiscal year spending puzzle, and the clock is forcing decisions. Democrats say DHS funding must come with enforceable limits on federal immigration operations, particularly ICE. Time reports Democrats are pushing for reforms including judicial warrant requirements, clearer identification for agents, limits on mask use, expanded body camera coverage, updated use of force rules, and explicit restrictions aimed at preventing racial profiling. The Associated Press describes Democrats rejecting a White House proposal as incomplete and insufficient, arguing that commitments must be written into binding legislative text, not handled through informal guidance. The Democratic argument is straightforward. Immigration enforcement should follow standards closer to everyday policing. Clear identification, accountability mechanisms, and judicial oversight when entering private spaces. They say those changes protect civil liberties and reduce the risk of dangerous encounters, while helping rebuild trust in communities that fear aggressive enforcement. Republicans say these conditions would hamstring enforcement and set a precedent of attaching major policy restrictions to must-pass funding. Roll call reports the fight has become, in part, a battle over whether to temporarily extend funding at all, and Senate Democrats and Republicans have been divided on the short-term path forward as the deadline closes in. GOP leaders argue the public expects border and immigration enforcement to function at full capacity, and they warn that Democrats are using the threat of shutdown pressure to force changes that should be debated separately, not embedded inside a funding deadline. The standoff is also creating a split within Democratic ranks. Axios reports progressive Democrats have been furious with party leadership for repeatedly supporting ICE and DHS funding without securing what they consider meaningful reforms, with some activists and candidates pushing leaders to hold the line, even if that raises shutdown risk. That internal pressure matters because it shapes how many Democratic votes leadership can reliably deliver, especially if the compromise looks like funding first, reforms later. A DHS shutdown doesn't mean everything stops instantly. Many DHS functions are classified as essential, meaning some operations continue even during a funding lapse. But a shutdown can still cause serious disruption. Furloughs for non-essential staff, delays in hiring and training, contract interruptions, administrative slowdowns, and uncertainty across agencies that rely on steady appropriations. Time reports that some DHS activity could continue due to prior funding mechanisms, but it also notes lawmakers are warning of disruptions and operational strain if the standoff isn't resolved. In practical terms, a lapse could ripple across immigration enforcement. ICE and CBP operations may continue in key areas, but support functions, processing timelines, and back-office capacity can be affected. Air travel security, TSA screening continues, but staffing and overtime pressures can rise, and morale can take a hit. Disaster response. FEMA's posture is especially sensitive during any severe weather or disaster season, where logistics, reimbursements, and coordination capacity matter. Coast Guard and Secret Service. Mission-critical work continues, but budgeting uncertainty and delayed pay can strain readiness. Even when frontline employees are required to keep working, shutdown politics often creates a different kind of vulnerability. Worker morale, retention, and operational planning become harder when the agency is running on uncertainty. Both parties are trying to define the public narrative. Democrats want voters to see this as an accountability battle, a push to prevent overreach and require standards like warrants, identification, and transparency. Republicans want voters to see it as a security battle, arguing Democrats are risking national safety functions by putting restrictions on enforcement and using DHS as leverage. And because DHS is linked to emotionally charged issues, immigration, border security, public safety, and disaster response, the political incentives are intense. Every side believes the public may ultimately blame the other. Right now, there are three outcomes that Washington is circling. 1. A short-term extension, continuing resolution. Buy more time, avoid a lapse, and keep negotiating. Roll call reports this has been actively discussed, with lawmakers considering another temporary measure as the deadline nears. 2. A compromise package. Some enforceable reforms get included, possibly narrower than what Democrats want, while keeping core DHS operations funded for the year. Time suggests Democrats are resisting vague assurances and want binding commitments, which makes compromise harder but not impossible. 3. A partial DHS shutdown. If neither side moves and the deadline hits, the agency enters shutdown conditions, with both parties racing to assign blame and claim they were protecting the public interest. This is not just a routine budget clash. It's a fight over the boundaries of federal enforcement power, and it's playing out against the ticking clock of an expiring funding extension. If Congress fails to act by Friday night, the consequences won't be abstract. They'll land on agency operations, public services, and the stability of systems that Americans depend on, from airports to disaster response, while the political blame game begins. That's the latest. We'll continue tracking negotiations as the DHS deadline approaches.